I think that's all I want to say there. These C cells that we just talked about, they produce calcitonin. They do not have anything to do with the T3, T4, with the iodine, with any of that stuff. They just help regulate your calcium levels. All right, let me stop for a minute and go back. Let's talk about the thyroid gland. Let's talk about being hyperthyroid, or let's talk about being hypothyroid. Let's just say you're hyper. You have too much thyroid hormone. Well, people that are hyperthyroid tend to be skinny. They've been burning up so many calories. They eat like pigs. They're burning up lots and lots of energy. Everything's working overtime. They feel warm all the time because their internal furnaces are burning overtime. A lot of times that'll be diagnosed because a husband and wife will start fighting over the covers. One of them wants the covers off, one of them wants the covers on, and one can't ever get warm enough, one can't ever get cold enough. So if their thyroid level, a good thing to do in a case like that is to check their thyroid levels. Check both of them and see if one of them is hyper and one of them is hypo, or they're both normal. Who knows? Maybe they just want to fight and they bring it out in the covers. But anyway, it turns everything on and makes it faster. Their heart will beat faster. They'll breathe faster. Their temperature will be a little bit up. Now we're talking a half a degree or so. Instead of 98.6, they may normally walk around at 99.4 or something like that. They may be a little bit on the cold side, but mostly they're always putting on more clothes or taking off more clothes, depending on whether they're hypo or hyperthyroid. There's one thing that you need to know does not work in overtime in somebody that's hyperthyroid, and that is the menstrual cycle. In women who are hyperthyroid, they either don't have menstrual cycles or they have them very unoften. They might just have a menstrual cycle every 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks if their thyroid is working too fast. That's the only thing that doesn't work in hyperspeed. It actually slows down. So thyroid hormone can also be a problem with ladies who are having troubles getting pregnant. That's one of the very first tests you'd order on a couple that's not getting pregnant when they want to, is check the thyroid levels of the wife. I think I have some pictures. I'll come back to that a little bit. Let's talk about the parathyroid glands. The parathyroid glands are interesting. They're really tiny. They're about the size of a lima bean, maybe. And there's 4 of them generally, 2 on either side in the back of the thyroid gland. Now, this is weird, but in 1925, the only time that a surgeon ever received the Nobel Prize in medicine for doing a new operation was a guy by the name of Theodore Coker. He was at the Cleveland Clinic. And the Cleveland Clinic is in the middle of Oregon, which, is in the middle of the United States, which is called the thyroid belt. And it was called the thyroid belt or the goiter belt because there's very little iodine in the soil and in the water supplies all through Central America. So it was really common in these folks that didn't have any iodine. Remember, you need iodine to make thyroid hormone. Their thyroids were working overtime trying to make more, but they couldn't because they didn't have any iodine. They would develop these goiters. A goiter just means an enlarged thyroid. And I remember seeing a few of them in my early career that would just come in with these big old masses in their neck. And they got so big they couldn't swallow. They got so big they couldn't breathe right. And so back in the 20s, when this was really common, they had to do surgery on these. And he developed the technique of doing thyroid surgery. And he reported a series of, I think, 45 or 50 cases. It was like the first guy, because everybody else, when they tried to operate on the thyroid, the patients bled to death because it was such a bloody operation. But he developed these fancy little hemostats, which were really fine, and he could take out the thyroid without losing too much blood. And the problem was, out of the 50 patients, about 15 of them died. And they couldn't figure out why. Because they kept going into tetany and their muscles didn't work and they couldn't control anything. Come to find out, the parathyroid glands had never been identified before. And so he was taking out their thyroid gland, but he was also taking out their parathyroid glands. And when you take out their parathyroid glands, they can't maintain their calcium level, and they were dying of hypocalcemia. Kind of hard to imagine you'd win the Nobel Prize for results like that, but he did. And I mean, things were different back then. You know, if somebody dies of a thyroid surgery today, and there's very little thyroid surgery even done anymore, they'd probably be sued because it just shouldn't happen. You shouldn't die of thyroid surgery these days with modern techniques and everything. But it wasn't that way back then. Remember, the first appendectomy was done in 1914. That was the first time the disease of appendicitis was even named. And prior to 1914, 100% of all the people that had ever developed appendicitis prior to 1914, 100% of them died. It was a 100% fatal disease if not treated surgically. Your belly gets infected, you perforate your appendix, drains stool out into your abdomen, you get sick, 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 sick. They didn't have antibiotics, surgery was so dangerous they couldn't really do surgery. Everybody died. Anybody in here had their appendix out? My daughter has. Several other members of my family have. They would all have been dead. Just think about how far we've come in the last 100 years. That was just 102 years ago when appendicitis was named as a disease. Same thing happened here. And that was even 20 years later when we finally figured out what parathyroids were all about. So here's what they look like. This is viewed from the back. You notice this. So they're on the back. They're almost embedded in the thyroid gland. And I did surgery on the parathyroid glands a number of times during my career for people that had little tumors in their parathyroid glands. They would make too much parathyroid hormone, and their calciums were up through the roof, and they made kidney stones and had all kinds of problems. So we would operate on them, and finding them was tough, let me tell you, because the tissue looks almost exactly like the thyroid tissue, and it's not purple and orange like these here. They're almost exactly the same color, and you have to just get down there and look really careful, and then if you dissect really carefully and you don't have much bleeding, you can kind of tell what's what and find the parathyroid that's in trouble. This is what they look like under the microscope. You ought to look at these under the microscope as well. There's basically two kinds of cells in parathyroid glands. The parathyroid cells, the chief cells, which is the chief cell in them, and then these oxyphil cells, which are clearish cells. Lots of blood vessels running through them as well. There's where they are, and that's what they do. What are the effects of PTH? You do need to understand this because this goes into that calcium thing we're going to go into in much more detail as we go through all of this. Parathyroid hormone raises your calcium level. Okay? In order to raise your calcium level, it does it in 4 ways. Number 1, you remember the osteoclasts? Those are the cells that eat up bone. So it stimulates the osteoclasts. They start eating up bone. When it eats up the bone, it releases the calcium out into the bloodstream to raise your calcium level. It inhibits the osteoblasts. Remember, the osteoblasts are the ones that make new bone. Well, in order to make new bone, you've got to take calcium out of the bloodstream, put it into the new bone cell, so that lowers your calcium. So if you inhibit the osteoblast, that raises your calcium. It enhances reabsorption of calcium at the kidneys. In other words, we pee out calcium through our urine, but then we are able to reabsorb it as it goes down through the renal tubules and works its way through the kidneys, which we'll go into in great detail when we get to the kidney chapter. But it causes reabsorption of the calcium. That raises the calcium level. Okay? And the 4th way that it raises the calcium level is it causes those C cells, remember that we just talked about, the clear cells that are in between the follicles in the thyroid gland. It stimulates the formation of more I'm sorry, I said that wrong. That's not right. Calcitriol is at the calcium, as at the kidneys, and it enhances even more the calcium and phosphate reabsorption. So ignore what I just said. I didn't mean calcitriol, I meant, what's the hormone released by the calcitonin? Calcitonin. I got calcitonin and calcitriol messed up there. So there's the 4 ways. You need to know those. That's going to be important, not only now, but later. Okay, we'll stop right here and move along to lab. Remind me to pass out papers over there.